Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey into the realm of dreams and nightmares, exploring the complete history of the Emerald Nightmare, one of the most insidious threats ever to menace Azeroth. This is a tale of corruption that spans millennia, of ancient evils seeping into the most sacred places, of heroes who fought against darkness that twisted reality itself. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this haunting tale unfold before you. To understand the Emerald Nightmare, we must first understand the Emerald Dream itself, for one cannot exist without the other. The dream is not merely a place, but a concept made manifest, a vision of what Azeroth could be in its most perfect and untouched state. It exists outside the boundaries of the physical world, a vast and ever-changing realm of spirits and untamed nature that serves as a blueprint for the world of the waking. The Titans, those colossal beings who shaped the young worlds of the universe, created the Emerald Dream when they first ordered Azeroth. They looked upon the world they had shaped and saw its potential for growth and change, for the rise and fall of civilizations, for the march of progress that would inevitably alter the landscape. And they wished to preserve something of what Azeroth was in its primal state, a record of the world's natural perfection that would exist eternally. The dream they created was verdant beyond imagination. Endless forests stretched to horizons that never seemed to arrive, their canopies filtering light that came from no visible sun yet illuminated everything in shades of green and gold. Rivers flowed through valleys untouched by any hand, their waters pure and sweet, feeding into lakes that reflected skies of impossible beauty. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow that never melted, standing as silent witnesses to the eternal nature of this realm. Nothing in the Emerald Dream was built or cultivated or shaped by mortal hands. There were no roads, no cities, no farms or mines, or any of the structures that the races of Azeroth would eventually create. The dream showed the world as it would be if intelligent life had never arisen to change it, if nature had been allowed to grow and flourish according to its own designs forever. It was peaceful and beautiful and utterly wild. The Titans knew that such a realm would need a guardian, someone to watch over the dream and ensure that its purity was maintained through all the ages to come. For this sacred duty, they chose Ysera, one of the great dragon aspects, who had been empowered to protect different aspects of Azeroth. Ysera was given dominion over the Emerald Dream, bound to this ethereal realm in a way that no other being could claim. From the moment of her empowerment, Ysera descended into an endless trance, her eyes forever half closed as she walked between the waking world and the dream. She became known as the Dreamer, and her consciousness expanded to fill the vast spaces of her domain. Every tree, every flower, every blade of grass in the Emerald Dream was known to her. She felt the pulse of life that flowed through the realm, sensed the subtle rhythms of growth and decay that gave the dream its ever-changing nature. The green dragonflight, Ysera's children and servants, shared in her connection to the dream. They were creatures of nature magic, their scales the color of forest leaves, their eyes glowing with an inner light that reflected the dream's eternal vitality. The green dragons could walk the dreamways as easily as other dragons flew through the skies, passing between the physical world and the dream at will. They served as Ysera's eyes and hands in places she could not go, carrying out her will and protecting the dream from any who would threaten it. For countless millennia, this arrangement held. The Emerald Dream remained pristine, a perfect reflection of Azeroth's natural potential, watched over by the Dreamer and her dragonflight. The world of the waking changed around them, civilizations rising and falling, wars being fought and won and lost, but the dream remained constant. It was a refuge of peace in a universe that seemed determined to fill itself with conflict. The Druids were the first mortals to learn the secrets of the dream. These practitioners of nature magic discovered that they could, with sufficient training and dedication, project their spirits into the Emerald Dream while their bodies remained in the physical world. This ability came to be known as walking the dreamways, and it became one of the most prized skills a druid could develop. The Night Elf Druids were the first to master this art, taught by Cenarius himself, the demigod son of Elune and Malorn, who served as the Lord of the Forest. Cenarius had his own connection to the Emerald Dream, a bond that predated even Ysera's guardianship, and he shared his knowledge with those mortals who showed sufficient reverence for nature. Under his tutelage, the Druids learned to enter the dream, to walk its endless paths, to draw upon its power for their magic. The dreamways became highways for the Druids, allowing them to travel vast distances in moments by passing through the dream rather than crossing the physical world. They could also enter the dream simply to rest and meditate, to commune with the spirits of nature, to seek wisdom from Ysera herself. The dreamer welcomed these visitors, recognizing in them kindred spirits who loved nature as deeply as she did. Ysera became a mentor figure for many of the greatest druids. She offered guidance and wisdom to all who revered nature, helping them understand the deeper mysteries of the natural world and their place within it. Her voice echoed through the dreamways, speaking truths that could only be heard by those who had learned to listen. The Druids came to view her as a patron and protector, second only to Cenarius in their veneration. The Emerald Dream seemed invulnerable in those early days. What force could possibly threaten a realm of pure spirit, a place that existed outside the physical universe? The Titans had designed it to be eternal and unchanging, a perfect preservation of natural Azeroth. The green dragons guarded it with vigilance born of love, and the druids who walked its paths did so with reverence and care. Surely nothing could corrupt such a sacred place. But there were forces older than the Titans, darker than any evil the young world had yet known, and they were patient beyond mortal comprehension. They had been waiting, watching, scheming for longer than the dream had existed, and they had found a way in. The old gods were ancient beyond reckoning, beings of chaos and madness who had fallen to Azeroth from the great dark beyond in the earliest ages of the world. They came as parasites, burrowing into the planet's surface and sinking their tendrils deep into its flesh. They fed on the world spirit that slumbered at Azeroth's core, corrupting everything they touched, spreading their influence through the stone and soil like a cancer. The Titans had discovered the old gods during their ordering of Azeroth and had realized immediately that these entities were a threat to everything they hoped to create. But the old gods had already embedded themselves too deeply in the planet to be removed by force. To tear them out would be to destroy Azeroth itself, to kill the world spirit they had come to nurture. The Titans were forced to find another solution. They imprisoned the old gods instead, constructing vast facilities beneath the earth to contain these horrors and keep them from spreading their corruption further. The prisons were powered by ancient technology and guarded by constructs of Titan make, designed to hold their captives for all eternity. The Titans believed they had solved the problem, that the old gods would remain contained forever while the world above them flourished. But the Titans underestimated the patience and cunning of their enemies. The old gods were not mindless forces of destruction. They were intelligent beings with wills and desires and the ability to plan. They could not escape their prisons through strength alone, so they began to work through subterfuge instead. They whispered to the minds of those who ventured too close to their prisons, planting seeds of corruption that would grow over centuries. They waited for opportunities, for cracks in the containment, for any chance to extend their influence beyond their cells. 4 old gods were known to have been imprisoned beneath Azeroth. Sithun lurked beneath the deserts of Silithus, dreaming of insect armies and the end of all things. Yogg-Saron, the god of death, lay bound beneath the frozen lands that would become Northrend. Ysera had been torn from the world by the Titan Aman'Thul himself, leaving behind only a heart that continued to beat with malevolent purpose. And N'Zoth, perhaps the most cunning of them all, waited in the depths beneath the sea, his prison the deepest and most isolated of all. These beings communicated with each other despite their separation, sharing knowledge and coordinating their efforts across the vast distances that separated their prisons. They were patient in a way that mortal minds could not comprehend, willing to wait thousands of years for a single opportunity to advance their plans. Time meant nothing to entities that had existed since before time was measured. The corruption they spread was insidious. It did not announce itself with obvious signs of evil. Instead, it worked subtly, gradually changing the nature of whatever it touched. Stone exposed to old god influence became serenite, a metal that drove those who mined it to madness. Water that flowed near their prisons became poisonous to drink. The very air in certain places carried whispers that planted thoughts of despair and violence in the minds of those who breathed it. Yogg-Saron was the first of the old gods to find a path into the Emerald Dream. His prison lay beneath the land that would become Northrend, and serenite deposits had begun to emerge across the world, appearing wherever the old god's corruption had spread through underground channels. These deposits were like windows into the old god's realm, points where their influence could leak into the physical world. The god of death was patient. He did not try to break into the dream by force. Instead, he waited for an opportunity, for someone to unwittingly create a connection that he could exploit. And eventually, that opportunity came, delivered by those who should have been the dream's greatest protectors. Fandral Staghelm was one of the most powerful druids of his age, a night elf whose mastery of nature magic was exceeded only by a few. He had fought in wars that had reshaped the world, had helped defend his people against threats that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. His name was spoken with respect throughout the night elf territories, and his counsel was sought by leaders and priests alike. But Fandral carried a wound that would not heal. His son, Valstan, had been killed during the War of the Shifting Sands, torn apart by the Silithid in a battle that haunted Fandral's dreams. The grief of that loss had twisted something inside the great Druid, filling him with a need to prove himself, to accomplish deeds that would show the world his worth. This need would lead him to a decision that would have consequences he could never have imagined. The War of the Shifting Sands had been a desperate conflict against the Chiraji, an insectoid race that served the old god Sethun. The Chiraji had emerged from their hives in Silithus, threatening to overrun all of Kalimdor. Valstan had been a commander in that war, leading night elf forces against the endless swarms. He had fought bravely, had won victories that others thought impossible, had earned his father's pride with every battle. But the Chiraji were relentless, and even the bravest commanders could fall. Valstan was captured during a retreat, taken alive by the Silithid while Fandral watched helplessly. The general of the Chiraji forces, the dreaded Rajax, made a point of killing Valstan slowly, within sight of the night elf lines. Fandral saw his son die, saw him torn apart piece by piece, and could do nothing to stop it. That moment broke something in Fandral that could never be repaired. The grief became rage, the rage became obsession, and the obsession became a driving need to leave his mark on the world. He threw himself into increasingly ambitious projects, seeking achievements that would prove his worth, and perhaps in some way he could not articulate, honor the memory of his fallen son. The other druids watched Fandral's transformation with concern. They saw the darkness that had taken root in his spirit, the anger that lurked beneath his calm exterior. But Fandral was still one of the most powerful druids alive, still a leader whose abilities were desperately needed in the aftermath of the war. They did not challenge him, as they perhaps should have, did not intervene when he began to speak of projects that seemed beyond the scope of druidic tradition. Approximately 4,500 years before the First War, Fandral gathered a group of druids and set out on an ambitious mission. He had obtained 6 branches from Andrassil, the world tree that stood at the peak of Mount Hijal, and he intended to plant them at strategic locations across the world. These branches, he believed, would grow into great trees that would extend the influence of nature magic, creating new sources of power that the druids could draw upon. The plan seemed sound in theory. Nordrassil was the most powerful source of nature magic in the world, blessed by the dragon aspects themselves. If branches from the world tree could be made to grow elsewhere, they would create a network of power that would strengthen druidic magic everywhere. Fandral presented his proposal to the other druids, and despite some reservations, they agreed to support the endeavor. 5 of the branches were planted at locations that Fandral had carefully selected, places where the natural magic of the land was strong and where the trees would have the best chance of thriving. These 5 branches took root and grew into the great trees, massive growths that served as anchors for nature magic in their regions. The druids celebrated each success, seeing in these trees the beginning of a new age of natural power. But the 6th branch, the largest and most promising of them all, Fandral planted in a different sort of place. He had found a location in the Grizzly Hills where the soil seemed particularly fertile, where the conditions for growth appeared ideal. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that this fertility came from serenite deposits deep beneath the surface. The corruption of Yogg Saron had seeped into the earth here, and the branch that Fandral planted was drinking deeply of that tainted soil. The sixth branch grew faster and larger than any of the others, becoming a world tree in its own right. Fandral named it Andrassil, which meant crown of the snow, and he looked upon it with pride. Here was his greatest achievement, a world tree that rivaled Nordrassil itself, a testament to his power and vision. He could not see the darkness that was growing within it. Andrassil's roots grew deep, deeper than any of the other great trees, pushing down through the earth in search of nutrients and water. And as they grew, they reached places that no roots should ever reach. They touched the boundaries of Yogg-Saron's prison, brushing against the barriers that contained the old god. And through that contact, the corruption flowed. The effects were not immediately obvious. The tree itself seemed healthy, its leaves green, and its bark strong. But the animals that lived near Andrassil began to change. They became aggressive without provocation, attacking creatures they would normally ignore. They developed strange growths and mutations, their bodies warping in ways that nature never intended. The local wildlife descended into madness, and those who studied them could find no explanation. The Druids who had planted Andrassil eventually recognized the signs of old god corruption. They traced the madness back to the tree itself and discovered, to their horror, what had happened. The roots of their creation had touched Yogg-Saron's prison, and the old god's influence was spreading through the tree like poison through veins. Andrassil had to be destroyed before the corruption could spread further. With heavy hearts, the Druids did what had to be done. They used their magic to kill Andrassil, destroying the world tree they had worked so hard to create. The great trunk fell, its branches withered, and the corruption that had spread through it seemed to die with it. The Druids mourned what they had lost, but consoled themselves with the belief that they had prevented a greater catastrophe. They were wrong. What the Druids did not understand was that the connection Andrassil had made to Yogg-Saron's prison had not only corrupted the tree, it had opened a doorway. The great trees that Fandral had planted were not merely physical objects. They existed partially in the Emerald Dream as well, their spirits extending into that ethereal realm, just as their roots extended into the earth. When Andrassil's roots touched Yogg-Saron, they created a bridge that the old god could use to access the dream. Even as the Druids were destroying Andrassil in the physical world, Yogg-Saron was sending tendrils of corruption through that bridge into the Emerald Dream. The seeds of the nightmare were planted in those dark days, scattered throughout the dreamways to take root and grow over the centuries to come. The old god was patient. He knew that these seeds would need time to mature, but he also knew that once they did, the dream itself would become his weapon. The corruption that Yogg-Saron began, another old god would eventually continue. N'Zoth, imprisoned beneath the sea, had been watching his brother's success with great interest. The Deep One was perhaps the most cunning of all the old gods, the most skilled at manipulation and deception. When he saw the opportunity that Yogg-Saron had created, he moved to claim it for his own. Over time, N'Zoth became the primary force behind the corruption of the Emerald Dream. He nurtured the seeds that Yogg-Saron had planted, helping them grow and spread. He added his own whispers to the dream, his own dark visions and promises of power. Where Yogg-Saron had opened the door, N'Zoth walked through it and made himself at home. The nightmare, as this corruption came to be called, grew slowly but inexorably. It was not a sudden invasion, but a gradual decay, like a wound that refuses to heal and slowly spreads infection through the body. The druids and dragons who guarded the dream sensed that something was wrong, but they could not identify the source. They fought against the corruption wherever it appeared, only to find it emerging somewhere else moments later. The Emerald Dream, that perfect vision of nature's potential, was slowly being transformed into something terrible. And at the heart of this transformation was a figure who had been dead for thousands of years, waiting in darkness for his chance at revenge. Lord Xavius was not born evil. He was born ambitious, which in his world amounted to much the same thing, but there was a time when he was merely a night elf like any other. That time ended when he felt the first whispers of Sargeras in his mind and recognized them for what they were, an opportunity for power beyond anything he had ever imagined. Before the War of the Ancients, before the first invasion of the Burning Legion, Xavius was the most powerful of the Highborn, the elite caste of Night Elf society who practiced the arcane arts. Only Queen Ysera herself exceeded his magical abilities, and she concealed her true power, allowing Xavius to be seen as the greatest of her servants. He was her high counselor, her most trusted advisor, the architect of many of her most ambitious projects. The Highborn drew their power from the Well of Eternity, the font of arcane energy that had been created by the Titans at the heart of ancient Kalimdor. The well's power was intoxicating, and the Highborn used it freely, weaving spells of increasing complexity and drinking deeply of its seemingly endless reserves. But their use of such power drew attention from beyond Azeroth, from entities that craved magical energy above all things. Sargeras, the Dark Titan, had been watching the Highborn's experiments with growing interest. The Fallen, champion of the Pantheon, led the Burning Legion, an army of demons dedicated to the destruction of all life in the universe, and he was always seeking new worlds to conquer. The magical emanations from the Well of Eternity drew his gaze to Azeroth, and he saw in this world a prize worth claiming. The Dark Titan could not simply invade Azeroth. The world was too far from any Legion-held territory, and the logistics of transporting an army across such distances were prohibitive. Instead, he needed to create a portal, a gateway that would allow his demons to step directly from their staging grounds to their target, and for that, he needed help from someone on Azeroth itself. Xavius was the first to hear Sargeras' whispers. The Dark Titan spoke to him in dreams, showed him visions of power and glory, promised him dominion over a new world order. Sargeras was a master of manipulation, and he knew exactly what to offer a being like Xavius. The Night Elf was vain, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. The Dark Titan offered to confirm all of his highest opinions of himself. The High Counselor became Sargeras' agent on Azeroth, working to prepare the way for the Legion's invasion. He convinced Queen Ysera to support the plan, appealing to her vanity and her desire for even greater power. Together, they began the ritual that would transform the Well of Eternity into a portal, a gateway through which the Burning Legion would pour into Azeroth. The War of the Ancients was the result. The demons came through the portal in numbers beyond counting, spreading across Kalimdor in a tide of fire and destruction. The Night Elves, who had not joined the Highborn's madness, fought back desperately, aided by the dragons, the earthen, and other races who recognized the threat. The war lasted for years, consuming countless lives and reshaping the face of the world. Xavius was a key figure in the Legion's plans, coordinating the defense of the portal and working to counter the efforts of those who sought to close it. He clashed repeatedly with Malfurion's Stormrage, the young Druid who had emerged as one of the Resistance's most powerful champions. Their rivalry would become personal, each seeing in the other a nemesis to be destroyed. The first time Malfurion killed Xavius, it was through nature magic that transformed the High Counselor's body into a twisted tree. The Druid had caught Xavius off guard, using powers that the Highborn had never anticipated. Xavius felt his flesh become bark, his blood become sap, his consciousness trapped in a form that could not move or speak. He raged against his imprisonment, but there was nothing he could do. Death would have been preferable to what came next. Sargeras was not pleased with his servant's failure. The Dark Titan reached across the void to claim Xavius's spirit, tearing it from the tree prison and subjecting it to torments that no mortal mind could comprehend. For what seemed like an eternity, Xavius suffered, his very essence being twisted and reshaped by Sargeras's will. When Sargeras was finally done, Xavius was no longer a night elf. His body had been transformed into something new, a creature with the legs and horns of a goat, with skin the color of dried blood, with eyes that burned with fell fire. He was the first satyr, the prototype for a race that would serve the Legion for all time. Sargeras had marked him as a servant and tool, changed him in ways that could never be undone. The Dark Titan gave Xavius a mission: return to Azeroth and corrupt as many of the Highborn as possible, transforming them into satyrs like himself. This new race would serve the Legion's purposes, spreading chaos and corruption wherever they went. Xavius accepted the task eagerly, seeing in it a chance for revenge against those who had failed to protect him from Malfurion's attack. He appeared to the Highborn in the night, offering them power and immortality in exchange for their service to Sargeras. Many accepted, unable to resist the promises he made, and the satyr race began to multiply. Xavius took particular pleasure in corrupting those who had once been his rivals, watching them transform into creatures like himself, their beauty replaced by his own twisted form. But Xavius's second existence was also cut short. Malfurion found him again, and this time the Druid was even more powerful. With the help of Tyrande Whisperwind and other heroes of the Resistance, Malfurion confronted the first satyr and struck him down. This time, the Druid transformed one of Tyrande's arrows into a tree that grew from Xavius's body, consuming him from within. The satyr lord died screaming, his form becoming one with the tree that devoured him. The War of the Ancients ended with the destruction of the Well of Eternity and the sundering of Kalimdor. The Legion was driven back, though at a terrible cost. Xavius was presumed destroyed forever, his story at an end. But death is rarely permanent for those who have caught the attention of powers beyond the mortal world. The old gods had been watching Xavius since his first contact with Sargeras. They recognized in him a useful tool, a being of hatred and ambition who could serve their purposes as readily as he had served the legions. When Xavius's spirit lingered after his second death, unable to move on, the old gods reached out and claimed it. N'Zoth was the one who spoke to Xavius in the darkness between worlds. The old god offered the satyr something that Sargeras never had, a chance for true revenge. The Legion had used Xavius and discarded him, and Zoth offered partnership, a role in plans that spanned millennia. Most importantly, N'Zoth offered Xavius dominion over the Emerald Nightmare, the corruption that was slowly spreading through the dream. Xavius accepted. He was resurrected once more, his spirit given new form and new purpose. He became the Nightmare Lord, the master of the darkness that was consuming the Emerald Dream. All the hatred he had accumulated over his many deaths and transformations, he now directed at the dream and its defenders. Malfurion, the druid who had killed him twice, walked those dreamways. Xavius would make him suffer. The satyrs that Xavius had created during the War of the Ancients became his servants in the nightmare. They spread the corruption wherever they went, carrying N'Zoth's taint to every corner of the dream. Other corrupted beings joined them, creatures that had once been defenders of nature, but had been twisted by the nightmare's influence. The forces of darkness in the dream grew stronger with each passing century. The first obvious signs of the nightmare's corruption appeared in the physical world long before anyone understood their true nature. In the Barrens of Kalimdor, a night elf druid named Narlex had discovered a network of caves called the Wailing Caverns. He believed that these caves could be transformed into a verdant paradise, a garden that would bring life to the harsh desert landscape. Narlex entered the Emerald Dream to reshape the Wailing Caverns, drawing upon the dream's power to fuel his ambitious project. But something went wrong. The portion of the dream that he accessed had been corrupted by the nightmare, and that corruption flowed back through his connection to affect both him and his acolytes. The druids who had followed Narlex into the Wailing Caverns were transformed into the Druids of the Fang, twisted beings who served the nightmare without understanding what had claimed them. They became hostile to all who approached, attacking anyone who ventured into their domain. Their forms changed, becoming more serpentine, more savage, less recognizable as the noble druids they had once been. Narlex himself fell into an endless sleep, his body lying motionless in the depths of the caves, while his spirit wandered lost in the nightmare. He could not wake, could not escape, could not call for help. His consciousness was trapped in a realm of darkness and horror, tormented by visions that he could not distinguish from reality. The corruption of the Wailing Caverns was a mystery to those who investigated it. The Druids of the Cenarian Circle sent agents to discover what had happened, but they could find no clear explanation for the transformation. They freed Narlex eventually, after years of effort, but the experience left scars that would never fully heal, and the Druids of the Fang remained corrupted, a permanent reminder that something was terribly wrong with the dream. Other incidents followed as the years passed. Druids who entered the dream sometimes failed to return, their bodies falling into comas from which they could not be roused. Those who did return spoke of dark places in the dream, regions where the light did not reach, and the air itself seemed poisonous. The green dragons grew increasingly concerned, but even Ysera could not determine the full extent of the corruption. The nightmare's influence was spreading, but it did so slowly enough that its true nature remained hidden. Each incident was treated as an isolated problem, a localized corruption that could be contained and eventually cleansed. No one recognized that all of these incidents were connected. that they were symptoms of a disease that was slowly consuming the entire dream. The green dragonflight fought against the corruption wherever they found it. They cleansed tainted regions of the dream, purged corruption from the dreamways, and protected the druids who walked those paths. But for every pocket of corruption they destroyed, another seemed to appear elsewhere. They were fighting a losing battle, and they did not even know it. The corruption of Ysera's lieutenants was the first sign that the nightmare had grown powerful enough to threaten the dream's greatest guardians. These 4 dragons, Lethon, Emerus, Tearar, and Isandre, were among the most powerful members of the Green Dragonflight. They had served Ysera faithfully for thousands of years, protecting the dream and guiding the druids who walked its paths. Their fall to the nightmare sent shockwaves through the entire flight. The corruption took hold gradually, so slowly that the dragons themselves did not recognize what was happening to them. They began to experience dark dreams during their rest periods, visions of decay and destruction that they attributed to the stress of their duties. They became irritable, short-tempered, prone to fits of anger that were unlike their normally serene dispositions. Their fellow dragons noticed the changes but could not identify the cause. One by one, the 4 lieutenants crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The nightmare's hold on them became complete, transforming them from guardians of the dream into agents of its corruption. Their scales darkened, their eyes took on a sickly glow, and their minds became focused on spreading the very corruption they had once fought against. The corrupted dragons did not remain in the dream. Instead, they emerged into the physical world, appearing at portals to the dream in locations scattered across Azeroth. They became known as the Dragons of Nightmare, and their presence was a blight upon the land. Where they walked, nature withered. Where they breathed, corruption spread. They had become monsters, enemies of everything they had once protected. Lethon appeared near the portal in the Ashenvale region, his presence causing the surrounding forest to decay. Plants died, animals fled, and the land itself seemed to recoil from his corruption. The night elves who guarded the portal were forced to retreat, unable to withstand the dragon's power. Before his corruption, Lethon had been known as one of the most compassionate of the green dragons, a guardian who took particular care of the younger druids who walked the dreamways for the first time. He had guided countless initiates through their early experiences in the dream, protecting them from dangers they did not yet know how to recognize. Now that same dragon spread corruption with every breath, killing the very nature he had once nurtured. The transformation of Lethon's personality was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his corruption. He retained his intelligence, his memories, his knowledge of druidic customs and vulnerabilities. But all of these gifts were now turned to evil purposes. He knew exactly how to hurt the defenders of nature, exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. His attacks were not random, but calculated, designed to spread despair as much as corruption. Emerus emerged in the Feralis region, bringing with her a pestilence that infected everything it touched. Her breath carried disease, and those exposed to it sickened and died within days. The local druids tried to contain the outbreak, but their magic was ineffective against corruption born of the nightmare. The sickness that Emerus spread was unlike any natural plague. It attacked not just the body, but the spirit, draining the will to live from those it infected. Victims experienced vivid nightmares even while awake, hallucinations that sapped their strength and drove them toward despair. Many who survived the physical symptoms never recovered mentally, haunted forever by what they had seen during their illness. The Cenarian Circle established quarantine zones around the areas Emerus had affected, trying to contain the spread of her corruption. Healers who entered these zones often fell ill themselves, their magic offering no protection against the nightmare's taint. The death toll mounted steadily, and the Druids began to wonder if this was a battle they could ever win. Tearar haunted the Duskwood portal, his presence adding to the already oppressive darkness of that cursed land. He spread fear and despair wherever he went, his mere presence enough to drive the weak-minded to madness. The humans of Darkshire learned to fear the nights when the green dragon's shadow passed over their town. Duskwood had already been a place of darkness before Tearar arrived, cursed by the presence of Karajan and the scourge of undeath that had touched its borders. But Tearar's corruption added new layers of horror to an already haunted land. The shadows grew deeper, the nights grew longer, and the creatures that lurked in the darkness grew bolder. The Night Watch militia found themselves fighting threats that they could barely comprehend. The psychological damage that Tearar inflicted was perhaps worse than any physical corruption. Those who survived encounters with him often emerged changed, haunted by fears that they could not name or escape. They woke screaming from nightmares they could not remember, flinched at shadows that were not there, and gradually withdrew from all human contact. Some took their own lives rather than endure the endless torment. The children of Darkshire were particularly vulnerable to Tearar's influence. They dreamed of the dragon even when awake, saw his form lurking in every dark corner, heard his whispers in every gust of wind. Parents watched helplessly as their children retreated into worlds of fear that no comfort could penetrate. The generation that grew up under Tearar's shadow carried scars that would never fully heal. Isandre appeared at the portal in Hinterlands, corrupting the land that the Wildhammer dwarves called home. Her influence turned the wildlife aggressive, caused the plants to become poisonous, and created an aura of unease that affected all who came near. The dwarves fought back as best they could, but they were no match for an ancient dragon. The heroes of Azeroth eventually confronted these corrupted dragons, battling them in epic encounters that tested the limits of mortal power. The dragons of Nightmare were incredibly dangerous, their corruption giving them abilities that normal dragons did not possess. They could create illusions, spread disease with their breath, and draw upon the Nightmare's power to enhance their already formidable strength. Defeating the dragons of Nightmare did not cleanse them of their corruption. Their taint was too deep for any mortal magic to purge. The green dragonflight mourned their fallen comrades, but they also recognized that the corruption which had claimed them was a threat that could potentially affect any of them. If Ysera's most trusted lieutenants could fall, was anyone safe? Ironicus, another powerful green dragon, followed the same path to corruption, though his story had additional layers of tragedy. He had been the consort of Ysera herself, one of the most important figures in the green dragon flight. His fall to the Nightmare was a personal blow to the dreamer, a loss that affected her more deeply than the corruption of her lieutenants. The temple of Atal Hakar built by the Adel-Eye trolls in the Swamp of Sorrows became Irenicus's prison and his domain. The trolls had sought to summon Hakr the Soul Flayer, a blood god of terrible power, and the dimensional instability they created attracted the nightmare's attention. Irenicus, sent to investigate, was caught by the corruption and transformed into a servant of the darkness. For years, Irenicus lurked in the temple, spreading corruption and tormenting those who ventured into his domain. He believed that Ysera had abandoned him, that his beloved had left him to suffer in the nightmare's grip. This perceived betrayal fed his rage, turning him against those he had once protected. He became a figure of tragedy, a reminder of how the nightmare could twist even the purest souls. Irenicus was eventually cleansed of his corruption, freed from the nightmare's influence through the combined efforts of Tyrande Whisperwind and a group of mortal heroes. The process required a ritual of redemption, a plea to Elune herself to purify the corrupted dragon. When the goddess answered, Irenicus's mind was restored, and he returned to Ysera's side, but his liberation came at a cost. The memory of what he had done while corrupted haunted Irenicus, filled him with guilt and shame that he could never fully shed. He had been a monster, an enemy of nature, a betrayer of everything he believed in. That he had not been in control of his actions offered little comfort. The hands that had committed the crimes were still his hands. Malfurion Stormrage was the greatest druid who had ever lived, the first of the night elves to master the ways of nature magic, the student of Cenarius himself. He had played a crucial role in defeating the Burning Legion during the War of the Ancients, and had guided his people through the millennia that followed. His name was spoken with reverence throughout the Night Elf territories and beyond, but even the greatest heroes can fall. Malfurion spent more time in the Emerald Dream than any other mortal, walking its paths, communing with its spirits, drawing upon its power for his magic. This deep connection made him a natural target for the nightmare's corruption. If N'Zoth and Xavius could claim Malfurion, they would deal a devastating blow to the defenders of nature. The Archdruid was too powerful to corrupt through subtle means. He would recognize any direct assault on his mind and would fight back with all his considerable strength. So the nightmare worked slowly, carefully, eroding his defenses over centuries. It planted doubts in his mind, created nightmares that disturbed his rest, whispered lies that seemed like truths. Malfurion fought against the corruption with everything he had. He recognized what was happening and tried to resist it, but the nightmare was relentless. Every time he drove back the darkness, it returned stronger than before. Every victory was followed by a defeat, every moment of clarity by hours of confusion. The Archdruid sought help from Cenarius, his mentor and friend. Together, they fought against the nightmare in the dream, pushing back the corruption wherever they found it. But even their combined power was not enough to cleanse the taint that had spread so deeply. The corruption that N'Zoth had planted was too extensive to be removed by any force they could bring to bear. Slowly, inexorably, Malfurion lost ground. The nightmare's influence grew stronger in his mind, clouding his judgment and sapping his will. He became an unwaking, one of the druids whose spirits had become trapped in the dream, unable to return to their bodies in the physical world. His physical form entered a coma from which it could not be roused, while his spirit wandered lost in a realm that had become a hell. The news of Malfurion's fall spread despair throughout the Night Elf people. Their greatest hero, their most powerful protector, had been claimed by the very corruption he had fought against. If Malfurion could not resist the nightmare, what hope did anyone else have? Tyrande Whisperwind, Malfurion's beloved, refused to give up hope. The High Priestess of Elune launched numerous expeditions into the dream, seeking to find and rescue her husband. She called upon every ally she could reach, every resource at her disposal, every favor she was owed. But the dream was vast, and the nightmare made it almost impossible to navigate. The search for Malfurion became one of the central quests of the Night Elf people. Druids volunteered to enter the dream and search for their archdruid, knowing that they risked sharing his fate. Many of them did not return. Those who did return spoke of horrors beyond description, of a dream that had become a landscape of terror and despair. Xavius watched these efforts with satisfaction. The Nightmare Lord had been preparing for this moment for centuries, building his power, spreading his corruption, waiting for the opportunity to claim his greatest enemy. Malfurion had killed him twice during the War of the Ancients. Now Xavius would make the Archdruid suffer for all eternity. The Satyr Lord sent his agents to torment Malfurion's wandering spirit, to drive him deeper into madness and despair. He showed the Archdruid visions of Tyrande's death, of the destruction of everything he loved, of a future where the nightmare had consumed all of Azeroth. He broke Malfurion down piece by piece, enjoying every moment of his enemy's anguish. But Xavius made a mistake that would prove fatal to his plans. He underestimated the love that Tyrande bore for Malfurion and the lengths she would go to save him. He underestimated the resilience of the Druids and the determination of the heroes who would eventually challenge his dominion. And he underestimated Malfurion himself, whose spirit, even when broken, never stopped fighting. Teldrassil was meant to be a new beginning for the Night Elves, a second world tree to replace the immortality they had lost. After the Third War, when Nordrassil's power was sacrificed to defeat the demon lord Archimond, the Night Elves found themselves mortal for the first time in 10,000 years. They would age, weaken, and eventually die like all other races. For a people who had known eternity, this was a devastating blow. Fandral Staghelm, now Archdruid of Darnassus, proposed a solution. He would grow a new world tree, one that would restore what had been lost. The other druids were skeptical. Creating a world tree was an undertaking of enormous complexity, and the last time Fandral had planted trees from Nordrassil's branches, the results had been mixed at best. But Fandral was persuasive, and his grief over the loss of immortality gave him a fervor that was difficult to resist. The seed that would become Teldrassil was planted on an island off the coast of Kalimdor, and it grew with supernatural speed. Within years, it had become a massive tree, its trunk wider than any structure the Night Elves had ever built. A city was constructed in its branches, Darnassus, which became the new capital of the Night Elf people. Fandral's vision seemed to have been vindicated, but the dragon aspects refused to bless Teldrassil as they had blessed Nordrassil. Nosdormu, the bronze aspect, declined to grant the tree power over time. Alexstrasza, the red aspect, would not give it the gift of life. And Ysera, despite her close relationship with the night elves, would not bless the tree with the nature magic of the dream. Without these blessings, Teldrassil could not grant immortality. It was just a very large tree. The aspect's refusal seemed merely unfortunate at the time, but they had recognized something that the night elves had not. There was something wrong with Teldrassil, a taint that they could sense but could not clearly identify. The tree was not healthy. It was corrupt from its very roots, and blessing it would only spread that corruption further. Xavius had manipulated Fandral into planting Teldrassil. The Nightmare Lord had reached out to the Archdruid through dreams, appearing in the guise of his dead son Valston and whispering suggestions that seemed to come from Fandral's own mind. The seed that Fandral had planted was not merely a branch from Nordrassil. It had been touched by Xavius, carrying a fragment of the nightmare's corruption within it. The world tree grew corrupt from the moment of its planting. The nightmare's taint spread through its trunk and branches, infecting the city that was built within it. The night elves who lived in Darnassus did not recognize the corruption, but it affected them nonetheless. Their dreams grew darker, their dispositions more melancholy, their connection to nature subtly weakened. Fandral Staghelm himself was corrupted by the influence he had unknowingly embraced. The visions he received from Xavius drove him toward increasingly extreme actions, isolating him from his fellow druids and filling him with paranoid suspicions. He became tyrannical in his leadership, driving away those who might have helped him resist the corruption. The extent of Teldrassil's corruption was not fully understood until much later, when the dragon aspects finally revealed what they had sensed. By then, the damage had been done. The night elves had built their capital in a tree that was a conduit for the nightmare's power, had made their home in a place that was slowly poisoning them. Efforts were made to cleanse Teldrassil, and some success was achieved. Druids and priestesses worked together to purify the tree, to remove the corruption that had taken root within it. The tree was eventually blessed by Alexstrasza and Ysera, though only after extensive cleansing had made it safe to do so. But the scars of the corruption remained, and Teldrassil was never quite what it should have been. The third invasion of the Burning Legion brought the conflict with the nightmare to a head. The demons returned to Azeroth in greater numbers than ever before, launching a massive assault that threatened to overwhelm the world's defenders. Among the many battlefronts that opened during this invasion, one of the most critical was in Val'shara, the ancient forest where Druidism had been born. Val'shara held a special place in the hearts of all who revered nature. This was where Cenarius had first taught the Druids, where Malfurion had taken his first steps on the path that would make him the greatest of his kind, where the ancient traditions of nature magic had been codified and passed down through the generations. The forest was sacred ground, a place where the boundary between the physical world and the emerald dream was particularly thin. The great trees of Val'shara had stood for 10,000 years, their canopies forming a living cathedral that sheltered all who sought refuge beneath them. Moonwells dotted the landscape, their waters blessed by a lune and infused with the power of the dream. Ancient ruins spoke of the Night Elf civilization at its height, when the forests had stretched unbroken across all of Kalimdor. But the Legion's invasion had brought more than demons to Val'shara. The nightmare, sensing opportunity in the chaos, had surged forward with unprecedented aggression. The ancient protections that had kept the corruption at bay began to fail, and the darkness that had lurked at the edges of the forest began to spread inward. Valshara was home to Shaladrassil, a world tree that had once been one of the most beautiful places in the dream. But the nightmare had corrupted Shaladrassil completely, transforming it into a source of darkness that spread corruption across both the dream and the physical world. The tree's branches reached toward a sky that was perpetually overcast. Its bark was covered in growths that pulsed with sickly light, and its roots had become conduits for the nightmare's power. The corruption of Shaladrassil was a wound that affected everything around it. The closer one approached the world tree, the more intense the nightmare's influence became. Plants that had flourished for millennia withered and died. Animals that had lived peacefully in the forest turned violent and predatory. Even the air itself seemed to carry whispers, suggestions that tried to plant seeds of despair in the minds of those who breathed it. The Druids, who had maintained Shaladrassil for generations, were among the first victims of its corruption. Many of them were transformed into nightmare creatures, their forms twisted beyond recognition by the dark power that flowed through the tree. Others were killed outright, their life force drained to feed the spreading darkness. A few escaped to warn the outside world, but they carried with them the scars of what they had witnessed. Xavius had made Shaladrassil his seat of power. From this corrupted world tree, the Nightmare Lord directed his forces, spreading the corruption ever outward. He had formed an alliance with the Burning Legion, though his true loyalty remained with the old gods. The demons were merely tools to be used and discarded. Xavius's real goal was the complete corruption of the Emerald Dream, and through it, all of Azeroth. The heroes who came to Valshara found a nightmare made manifest. The forests that had once been lush and beautiful were now decaying and hostile. The wildlife had been corrupted, transformed into monsters that attacked anything that moved. Even the air seemed poisonous, carrying whispers that tried to work their way into the minds of those who breathed it. Worse than any of this was the corruption of Ysera herself. The Dreamer, guardian of the Emerald Dream since before the Night Elves existed, had been claimed by the Nightmare. Xavius had targeted her specifically, knowing that her fall would deal a devastating blow to the forces of nature. He had sent his agents to wear down her defenses, to plant corruption in her mind, and finally to overwhelm her resistance entirely. The process of Ysera's corruption had been long and terrible. The Dreamer had fought against the Nightmare for millennia, her power and will keeping the corruption at bay, even as it consumed her lieutenants and threatened everything she protected. But the constant battle had taken its toll, and when Xavius focused all of his power against her, she could not withstand the assault. The corruption entered through her dreams, which for Ysera were not separate from her waking existence. She began to see darkness in places where there had been only light, to hear whispers that promised relief from her endless vigil. The nightmare showed her visions of a dream at peace, free from the eternal struggle against corruption. All she had to do was surrender, to let the darkness take her, and the fighting would finally end. Ysera resisted these temptations with everything she had. She called upon the power of the dream itself drew strength from the dragons who served her, sought wisdom from the druids who revered her. But each day the corruption grew stronger. Each night the whispers grew louder. Each moment the darkness crept a little further into her soul. The final assault came when Ysera was at her weakest. Xavius had timed his attack perfectly, striking when the dreamer's defenses were low and her allies were scattered. He poured the accumulated power of the nightmare into her mind, overwhelming her resistance with sheer force. Ysera screamed, a sound that echoed through both the dream and the physical world, and then she was silent. The corrupted Ysera was a horror beyond imagining. The dragon who had embodied the peace and beauty of the dream had become a monster of rage and destruction. Her scales, once the color of spring leaves, had darkened to the shade of rotting vegetation. Her eyes, which had always been half closed in eternal dreaming, now blazed with the sickly light of the nightmare. She attacked those who approached her, lashing out with power that should have been used to protect. The corruption had not merely changed Ysera's allegiance, it had twisted her very nature. All the love she had felt for the dream became hatred for those who defended it. All the wisdom she had accumulated over millennia was turned to planning the destruction of everything she had once cherished. She was still Ysera in form, but everything that had made her the dreamer was now working toward the opposite purpose. Tyrande Whisperwind found herself facing an impossible choice. Ysera was one of the most sacred beings in Night Elf culture, a figure of reverence and worship. But the corrupted dragon was also a threat that could not be allowed to continue. Every moment she remained under the nightmare's control, she spread corruption further. Every attack she made killed defenders who were desperately needed elsewhere. With prayers to Elune and tears in her eyes, Tyrande took up her bow and shot Ysera through the heart. The arrow carried the blessing of the goddess, and it pierced the corruption that had claimed the dragon. Ysera fell, her body crashing to the ground with a sound that echoed through the forest. But death was not the end for Ysera, not entirely. As her body lay broken on the ground, Elune herself intervened. The goddess gathered the dragon's spirit, lifting it up from the corruption that had surrounded it, purifying it with her divine light. Ysera's essence rose into the sky, becoming a constellation that would shine forever as a memorial to the dreamer's sacrifice. Thus, the light of those new stars drove back the corruption in Valshara, cleansing the land of the nightmare's immediate influence. But Ysera was still gone, her guidance lost, her protection withdrawn. The Emerald Dream would have to survive without its guardian, at least for a time. The Emerald Nightmare raid was the final confrontation between the forces of nature and the corruption that had been consuming the dream for millennia. Heroes from across Azeroth gathered to enter the nightmare itself, to fight through its horrors, and to confront Xavius at its heart. The entrance to the raid was through Andrassil, the corrupted world tree. The heroes descended into its depths, passing through layers of corruption that grew more intense the further they went. The air was thick with the nightmare's influence, trying to work its way into their minds and turn them against each other. Nithendra was the first major challenge the heroes faced. She had once been a guardian of the dream, a powerful creature who protected its secrets and guided those who walked its paths. But the nightmare had corrupted her completely, transforming her into a monster that fed on the life force of everything around her. The battle against Nethendra was exhausting. She summoned swarms of insects to attack the heroes, drew upon the nightmares' power to enhance her own abilities, and fought with a fury born of corruption and madness. The heroes had to coordinate their attacks carefully, avoiding the patches of rot she left behind and cleansing each other of the corruption she spread. When Nethendra finally fell, the heroes pressed deeper into the nightmare. They encountered other corrupted beings along the way, each presenting unique challenges that tested their courage and skill. Eleretha Renferal had once been a respected night elf druid, a guardian of the natural world who had spent centuries protecting the forests she loved. But the nightmare had found her during one of her journeys through the dreamways, seizing upon a moment of vulnerability to plant its corruption deep within her soul. She had fought against the darkness for as long as she could, but eventually her resistance crumbled and she was transformed into something terrible. The creature that Elereth became bore little resemblance to the druid she had once been. The nightmare had merged her with the form of a massive spider, creating a hybrid horror that combined the worst aspects of both. She retained her intelligence, her knowledge of druidic magic, but these gifts were now turned to hunting and killing those who had once been her allies. The battle against Elereth was complicated by her ability to shift between forms, becoming either a spider that dangled from webs of nightmare energy or a hideous bird-like creature that attacked from above. The heroes had to adapt their strategies constantly, responding to her transformations while avoiding the pools of toxic corruption she left in her wake. Her screams echoed through the nightmare, cries of rage that might once have been calls for help. Ursoc, the ancient bear guardian, was another tragedy among the bosses of the Emerald Nightmare. He had been one of the great wild gods, spirits of nature given physical form to protect the forests of Azeroth. For thousands of years, Ursoc had watched over the creatures of the wild, defending them from threats both natural and supernatural. His strength was legendary, his devotion to his duty absolute. But the nightmare had claimed even this mighty guardian. The corruption had seeped into Ursoc's dreams, twisting his protective instincts into murderous rage. The bear who had once sheltered the weak now hunted them, using his immense strength to destroy rather than protect. His roars, which had once been warnings to predators, became challenges to all who dared approach. Fighting Ursoc was a test of endurance. The corrupted wild god could absorb incredible amounts of damage, his natural resilience enhanced by the nightmare's power. His charges could send entire groups of heroes flying, and his claws could tear through the strongest armor as if it were paper. The heroes had to work together, coordinating their defenses and attacks to gradually wear down a being who seemed almost invincible. The death of Ursoc was necessary to end his suffering, but it brought no joy to those who struck the final blows. Here was a creature who had never asked for power, who had only ever wanted to protect the world he loved, and the nightmare had turned him into a monster. His fall was a reminder of what was at stake in this battle, of how even the mightiest could be corrupted. Il'gynoth was perhaps the most disturbing of these encounters. The creature was not truly a being in its own right, but a manifestation of the nightmare's will, a voice through which N'Zoth himself could speak. Il'gynoth resembled nothing so much as a massive eye, set within a pulsing mass of corruption that grew from the trunk of a nightmare-infested tree. Its gaze seemed to pierce directly into the souls of those who faced it, seeing not just their physical forms, but their deepest fears and secret shames. The battle against Il'gynoth was as much psychological as physical. The creature constantly whispered to the heroes who fought it, speaking words that seemed designed to break their spirits and turn them against each other. Some heard promises of power, offers to spare them if they would only turn on their companions. Others heard revelations of betrayals they had committed or would commit, their darkest impulses laid bare before all. The physical fight required the heroes to destroy the corruption that protected Il'gynoth, breaking through defensive tendrils and adds to expose the eye itself. But even when they succeeded in dealing damage, the creature continued its whispers, prophesying futures that none of them wanted to contemplate. Flesh is his gift. He is your true creator. The King of Diamonds has been made a pawn. The Lord of Ravens will turn the key. 5 keys to open our way, 5 torches to light our path. Her heart is a crater, and we have filled it. To find him, drown yourself in the circle of stars. The boy king serves at the master's table. 3 lies will he offer you. These cryptic utterances haunted those who heard them long after the battle ended. Were they true prophecies, or merely tricks designed to sow discord and fear? The heroes could not say, but the words stuck in their minds, surfacing at unexpected moments to cast doubt on allies and question loyalties. The whispers would prove prophetic in ways that no one could have anticipated at the time. They were warnings of events that would unfold years later, when N'Zoth finally made his move against Azeroth. The King of Diamonds was Magni Bronzebeard, who had been turned to diamond and would later be manipulated by the old god. The Lord of Ravens was Medivh's son Medon in some interpretations, or perhaps Khadgar. The boy king was Anduin Wrynn, whose wisdom would be tested by 3 lies. Each prophecy would find its fulfillment in time, proving that Il'gynoth's words were more than mere intimidation. But in the moment, the heroes could not know this. They fought through the horror of Il'gynoth's revelations, maintaining their resolve despite every attempt to break them. When the eye finally closed for the last time, they felt not triumph, but exhaustion, their minds as battered as their bodies. The heart of the nightmare, where Xavius waited, was a corrupted version of Cenarius's grove. The demigod himself had been claimed by the corruption, transformed into a servant of the nightmare just as Ysera had been. The heroes had to fight Cenarius before they could reach Xavius, a battle that required them to harm one of the most sacred figures in Druidic tradition. The grove had once been a place of indescribable beauty, where the boundaries between the physical world and the dream were so thin that flowers from both realms grew side by side. Cenarius had taught his first students here, had shared the secrets of Druidism with Malfurion and the others who would spread his teachings throughout the world. Now the grove was a twisted mockery of what it had been, the flowers replaced by growths of nightmare corruption, the gentle light replaced by sickly shadows. Cenarius himself stood at the center of the corrupted grove, but he was barely recognizable as the wise and gentle demigod who had guided countless druids through the centuries. The corruption had warped his form, adding thorns and spines to his body, darkening his eyes to pools of shadow, surrounding him with an aura of decay that killed any plant that tried to grow near him. He no longer spoke in the measured tones of a teacher, but in the snarling voice of a predator defending its territory. The sight of Cenarius in this state was almost too much for some of the Druids among the heroes. They had venerated him all their lives, had sought his wisdom in their darkest hours, had believed him to be beyond the reach of any corruption. To see him reduced to this, to know that they would have to fight him, was a blow that struck at the very foundations of their faith. Malfurion Stormrage aided in this fight. The Archdruid had finally been freed from the Nightmare's grip, rescued through the combined efforts of Tyrande and the heroes who had fought through Valshara. Though still weakened by his long imprisonment, Malfurion could use his magic to cleanse portions of the battlefield, creating safe zones where the heroes could recover and where their attacks against Cenarius would be more effective. The Archdruid's presence on the battlefield was both a blessing and a curse. His power was essential to the fight, but his emotional connection to Cenarius made every moment of the battle an agony. This was his teacher, his mentor, the being who had guided him toward becoming the druid he was today. Every blow that the heroes struck against Cenarius was a wound in Malfurion's heart. Throughout the fight, Malfurion called out to his mentor, trying to reach whatever part of Cenarius remained beneath the corruption. He spoke of their first meeting, of the lessons they had shared, of the love that bound them despite the darkness that had come between them. His words seemed to cause Cenarius pain, as if some part of the demigod still remembered and still fought against the corruption that controlled him. The battle against Cenarius was designed not to kill him, but to free him. The heroes had to weaken the demigod enough that the corruption could be driven out of him, while Malfurion worked to purify his mentor's spirit. It was a delicate balance, requiring precise timing and coordination. Too much damage would kill Cenarius. Too little would allow him to overwhelm the heroes with the nightmare's power. When the battle finally ended, Cenarius collapsed, freed from the nightmare but severely weakened. Malfurion immediately began the work of cleansing him fully, drawing upon all his remaining strength to purify his mentor's spirit. The process would take time, but Cenarius would eventually recover. Malfurion could not accompany the heroes to the final confrontation with Xavius. The Nightmare Lord waited in the Rift of Aln, the deepest part of the nightmare, and Malfurion could not enter that place. Whether it was because the rift would corrupt him again, or because his presence there would somehow serve Xavius's purposes, the Archdruid remained behind to tend to Cenarius. The Rift of Aln was the heart of the Emerald Nightmare, the place where the corruption had originally taken root and from which it had spread throughout the dream. It was a wound in reality itself, a point where the boundaries between the dream and the old god's domain had been torn open. The darkness there was absolute, and the corruption was so thick that merely being present threatened to overwhelm the minds of those who entered. The descent into the rift was unlike anything the heroes had experienced in the rest of the raid. The corrupted landscapes of the earlier encounters, horrible as they were, had at least been recognizable as twisted versions of natural places. The rift was something else entirely, a void where the normal rules of existence did not apply. Direction lost meaning, time flowed strangely, and the whispers of the nightmare became so loud that they drowned out all other thought. The very fabric of the rift seemed designed to break the will of those who entered. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, but an active presence, a weight that pressed against the spirit and tried to crush all hope. Shapes moved in that darkness, half-seen horrors that might have been manifestations of the nightmare, or might have been tricks of perception. The heroes could not be certain which was worse. Some of those who entered the rift reported experiencing visions during the descent, glimpses of possible futures where the nightmare had won. They saw Azeroth consumed by corruption, its defenders twisted into servants of N'Zoth, its lands transformed into endless wastelands of despair. These visions were so vivid that they seemed more real than the darkness that surrounded them, and shaking them off required tremendous effort. Others heard voices in the rift, not the external whispers of the nightmare, but internal voices that seemed to come from within their own minds. These voices spoke in the tones of loved ones, of friends and family members, urging them to turn back, to surrender, to accept that the fight was already lost. Distinguishing these false voices from genuine thoughts was nearly impossible. Xavius waited at the center of this darkness, the nightmare lord in his domain. He had been preparing for this confrontation for thousands of years, building his power, gathering his servants, waiting for the moment when he could finally destroy those who had opposed him. The heroes who came to challenge him were walking into a trap, and he was confident that they would not survive. The Nightmare Lord had changed since his days as a night elf, changed even since his first transformation into a satyr. Millennia of exposure to the old god's power had warped him beyond recognition, transforming him into a massive creature whose form seemed to shift and flow like the darkness around him. His eyes burned with the same sickly light that pervaded the entire nightmare, and his voice carried the weight of countless corrupted souls. The final battle against Xavius was the most challenging encounter in the Emerald Nightmare raid. The Nightmare Lord wielded power that had been accumulated over millennia, drawing upon the corruption of the entire dream to fuel his attacks. He could create illusions that were indistinguishable from reality, summon nightmares that targeted the deepest fears of his enemies, and corrupt the minds of those who faced him. The fight had multiple phases, each more dangerous than the last. In the first phase, Xavius attacked directly, testing the heroes' defenses and measuring their strength. He surrounded himself with corrupted ads, forcing the heroes to divide their attention between him and the minions he summoned. He cast debuffs that spread corruption through the raid, requiring constant cleansing to prevent overwhelming damage. Throughout this phase, Xavius taunted the heroes with words designed to break their will. He spoke of Malfurion's suffering during his imprisonment, describing in detail the torments he had inflicted on the Archdruid. He mocked the death of Ysera, claiming credit for the corruption that had claimed her. He promised each hero a place in his nightmare, a personal hell tailored to their deepest fears. The corruption that Xavius spread was unlike anything the heroes had encountered before. It did not merely damage their bodies, but attacked their minds, filling them with visions of despair and hopelessness. Some saw themselves failing, watching helplessly as their companions fell one by one. Others saw the faces of those they had lost, loved ones blaming them for not saving them. The strongest wills could shake off these visions, but weaker minds could be lost entirely. In the second phase, Xavius drew the heroes into his nightmare, a realm within the nightmare where his power was even greater. Here, the rules of reality did not apply. Heroes could be separated from each other, forced to face personal nightmares alone, subjected to effects that would have been impossible in the physical world. Only by maintaining their focus and supporting each other could they survive this phase. This nightmare realm was crafted specifically to torment those who entered it. Each hero found themselves in a landscape drawn from their own fears, facing enemies that knew their weaknesses. A warrior might find herself unable to lift her weapon, her strength drained away. A priest might discover that her healing magic only caused more pain. A hunter might watch helplessly as the creatures he commanded turned against him. Escaping these personal nightmares required more than physical strength. It required mental fortitude and, crucially, the support of allies. Those who had been drawn into the nightmare could be rescued by companions who entered after them, breaking the illusions through the power of shared purpose. The raid had to function as a unit, each member watching for signs that others had been claimed by the nightmare and moving to free them. Xavius himself could enter these personal nightmares, appearing as a figure of ultimate terror. His presence magnified every fear, made every nightmare more vivid and more painful. Facing him in this realm was almost impossible. The only solution was to escape before he arrived, to break free of the illusion and return to the main battlefield. The final phase was the most intense. Xavius drew upon the full power of the Rift of Aln, becoming a conduit for the corruption that had been building for thousands of years. His attacks became devastating, his defenses nearly impenetrable. The heroes had to coordinate their abilities perfectly, burning through his remaining health before the corruption overwhelmed them entirely. In this phase, the entire rift seemed to come alive, the darkness itself attacking alongside the Nightmare Lord. Tendrils of corruption erupted from the ground, zones of absolute darkness appeared and disappeared without warning, and the whispers became so loud that communication between the heroes was nearly impossible. Each moment felt like an eternity, each second of survival a victory against impossible odds. Xavius held nothing back in this final confrontation. He had waited thousands of years for this moment, had built his entire existence around the destruction of those who opposed him, and he would not accept defeat. He drew upon reserves of power that even the old gods might have envied, channeling the accumulated corruption of millennia into devastating attacks that threatened to annihilate the entire raid. The heroes pushed back with everything they had. Healers burned through their mana reserves, keeping tanks alive against damage that should have been instantly lethal. Damage dealers pushed their abilities to the breaking point, squeezing every bit of extra output from their rotations. Tanks used every cooldown, every defensive ability, knowing that a moment's lapse would mean death for everyone. When Xavius finally fell, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The Nightmare Lord's death broke the connection between the corruption and its master, causing the darkness throughout the dream to begin dissipating. The sickly light that had pervaded the nightmare gave way to the natural green glow of the dream. The corrupted landscapes began to heal, the twisted creatures began to flee or die. But the victory was not complete. The rift of Aun remained, a wound in the dream that could not be closed by Xavius's death alone. The corruption that had seeped through it over the millennia could not be entirely purged. The heroes had won a great battle, but the war against the nightmare was not over. Those who carried Xalatath, the blade of the Black Empire, heard the weapons speak as they left the rift. The artifact had been forged by the old gods, and it retained a connection to them that allowed it to perceive things that mortals could not. What it said was chilling. The nightmare was almost entirely removed from this place. It would seem that Elereth was more susceptible to its influence than the rest, but the rift of Aun is deep and vast, and the old god's prison grows ever weaker. This was a warning that the threat was not ended, merely contained. And Zoth still lurked in his prison, still scheming, still waiting for another opportunity to spread his corruption. The nightmare might have lost its lord, but the darkness that had created it remained. The aftermath of the Emerald Nightmare raid saw the beginning of the dream's healing. With Xavius defeated and the corruption driven back, the Druids and Green Dragons could finally begin the work of restoration that had been impossible for so long. They cleansed corrupted regions of the dream, purified tainted spirits, and repaired the damage that had accumulated over millennia. The work of restoration was slow and painstaking. Each corrupted region of the dream had to be approached carefully, its taint analyzed and understood before any attempt at cleansing could begin. Some areas responded well to druidic magic, their corruption fading like morning mist under the sun. Others proved more resistant, requiring repeated treatments over weeks or months before they showed any improvement. The druids who undertook this work found themselves changed by the experience. Walking through regions that had been corrupted by the nightmare exposed them to traces of that corruption, wisps of darkness that clung to their spirits even after the visible taint had been removed. Some developed an increased sensitivity to corruption, able to detect the nightmare's influence before it became visible. Others found that their dreams were haunted by echoes of what they had encountered. The Cenarian Circle organized the restoration efforts, coordinating groups of druids who specialized in different aspects of cleansing. Some focused on purifying the spirits that had been corrupted, using rituals that had been developed specifically for this purpose. Others concentrated on restoring the physical aspects of the dream, regrowing the forests that had been destroyed, and cleansing the waters that had been poisoned. The Green Dragons worked alongside the Druids, their connection to the dream allowing them to reach places that mortal magic could not touch. They sang songs of healing that resonated through the dreamways, their voices carrying power that helped accelerate the restoration. But their numbers had been reduced by the war against the nightmare, and there were fewer dragons to do the work than there had been before. Volunteers came from unexpected places to help with the restoration. Tauren druids, whose connection to the Earth Mother gave them a different perspective on nature magic, offered techniques that complemented the Night Elves' approach. Worgen druids, whose curse gave them a unique relationship with wild magic, proved particularly effective at tracking down hidden pockets of corruption. Even some trolls, whose Loa had their own connections to the natural world, contributed knowledge that proved valuable. The restoration of Valshara was particularly challenging. The physical world had been affected by the nightmare's presence, and simply defeating Xavius did not undo all the damage that had been done. The forests that had been corrupted remained blighted for years, slowly recovering as druids worked to heal them. The moonwells that had been tainted had to be purified one by one, their waters cleansed of the darkness that had seeped into them. The survivors of Valshara faced their own challenges. Many had lost friends and family to the nightmare, had watched loved ones be corrupted or killed. The trauma of those experiences did not simply vanish when the corruption was defeated. It lingered, affecting the survivors for years afterward. The druids who served as healers found themselves treating minds as often as bodies, helping people process grief that seemed beyond bearing. But the scars of the nightmare would never fully fade. Too much had been lost, too many had fallen, too much corruption had seeped too deeply into the dream's fabric. There were places in the dream that would never be entirely clean, pockets of darkness that persisted despite all efforts to purge them. The defenders of nature accepted this as the cost of their victory. Ysera's death left a void that could not easily be filled. The dreamer had been the heart of the green dragonflight, the source of their purpose and their power. Without her, the flight struggled to maintain its song cohesion. Some dragons fell into despair, questioning whether their purpose still had meaning. Others redoubled their efforts, determined to honor their fallen leader by protecting what she had loved. The mourning rituals for Ysera lasted for weeks. Dragons gathered at sacred sites throughout the dream, singing laments that echoed through the dreamways and could be heard in the physical world by those sensitive enough to listen. The songs spoke of Ysera's wisdom, her compassion, her tireless devotion to the dream she had guarded for so long. They spoke of her death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a passage to a different form of existence. The druids joined in these rituals, honoring the dragon who had guided and protected them for generations. They planted groves in her memory, sacred spaces where her name would be invoked in prayers and meditations. They composed poems and songs that would be passed down through the generations, ensuring that future druids would know of the dreamer and her sacrifice. For many of the green dragons, the loss of Ysera was more than the death of a leader. It was the loss of a mother figure who had nurtured them since their hatching. Ysera had been present at the birth of every green dragon for 10,000 years, had blessed each of them with her touch and her wisdom. Her absence left a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. The younger dragons were particularly affected. They had grown up believing that Ysera was eternal, that she would always be there to guide them and protect them. Her death shattered that belief, forcing them to confront their own mortality in ways they had never considered. Some became withdrawn, unable to process a loss so profound. Others became reckless, taking risks that endangered themselves and others. The elder dragons tried to hold the flight together, but they were struggling with their own grief. Many had known Ysera since the dawn of the world, had served alongside her through wars and crises spanning millennia. They had believed deep in their hearts that she would outlast them all. Her death reminded them that even the greatest beings could fall, that nothing was truly eternal. The green dragons eventually learned to function without Ysera, though they never stopped mourning her. They established new leadership structures, developed new methods of coordinating their efforts and found new ways to connect with the dream. The flight survived, but it was diminished, a shadow of what it had once been. Marithra emerged as the most likely successor to Ysera's role, though she was reluctant to claim a title that had belonged to her mother. She had her own connection to the dream, her own powers that had developed over millennia of service. But she knew that she could never truly replace Ysera, that the best she could hope for was to honor her mother's memory by continuing her work. The other dragon flights offered what support they could. Alexstrasza, the Lifebinder, spent time with the green dragons, offering comfort and counsel. Nosdormu, the Timeless One, spoke cryptically of the threads of fate that bound all beings, hinting that Ysera's story was not truly ended. Even Calicos, the young aspect of the blue dragonflight, contributed his wisdom, sharing perspectives that the grieving greens had not considered. Cenarius recovered from his corruption thanks to Malfurion's tireless efforts. The demigod was weakened by the experience, his power reduced from what it had once been, but he was himself again. He resumed his role as teacher and protector of the Druids, offering guidance to those who sought to follow the path of nature magic. His survival was one of the few bright spots in the aftermath of the nightmare. The process of Cenarius's recovery was long and difficult. Even after the corruption had been driven from his body, traces of it lingered in his spirit, dark memories that surfaced at unexpected moments. He would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a teaching, his eyes going distant as he relived some horror from his time under the nightmare's control. His students learned to wait patiently during these episodes, understanding that their teacher was fighting battles they could not see. Cenarius's grove, the sacred space where he had taught the first Druids, had to be rebuilt from nothing. The corruption had destroyed everything that had grown there, leaving only barren ground where ancient trees had once stood. The demigod himself led the restoration, channeling what remained of his power into new growth that would, in time, create a grove worthy of its heritage. The new grove was different from what had come before. Where the original had been a place of unblemished beauty, the restored version carried visible reminders of what had happened. Cenarius deliberately incorporated these reminders, planting trees that grew in twisted shapes, cultivating flowers that bloomed in unusual colors. The grove would never pretend that the nightmare had not happened. Instead, it would serve as a memorial to those who had suffered. Young Druids who came to study with Cenarius found him changed from the figure they had heard about in stories. He was still wise, still patient, still devoted to teaching the ways of nature magic. But there was a sadness in his eyes that had not been there before, a weight of experience that made him seem older than his already ancient years. His lessons now included warnings about the nightmare that earlier students had never needed to hear. Malfurion's storm rage emerged from the experience, changed in his own ways. His long imprisonment in the nightmare had marked him in ways that would never fully heal. He had nightmares of his own now, echoes of the torment he had endured. But he had also gained a deeper understanding of the corruption and how to fight it. His experience, painful as it was, had made him an even more effective defender of the dream. The Archdruid found it difficult to return to normal life after what he had endured. Simple pleasures that had once brought him joy now seemed hollow, overshadowed by memories of the darkness. He would sit for hours in meditation, not seeking wisdom, but simply trying to quiet the voices that still echoed in his mind. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and often interrupted by dreams that were almost indistinguishable from his time in the nightmare. Malfurion threw himself into work as a way of coping with his trauma. He led restoration efforts throughout the dream, personally traveling to corrupted regions that other druids were afraid to approach. He developed new techniques for detecting and purifying the nightmare's taint, techniques that drew upon his intimate knowledge of how the corruption worked. If he could not escape what had happened to him, he could at least use it to help others. The Archdruid also took on the task of training a new generation of Dreamwalkers, druids who would specialize in protecting the dream from future threats. He was brutally honest with his students about the dangers they would face, describing the horrors of the nightmare in detail that made some of them reconsider their calling. Those who remained were stronger for the knowledge, prepared for challenges that their predecessors had never imagined. The relationship between Malfurion and Tyrande was strengthened by their ordeal. She had never given up on him, had fought through impossible odds to reach him and free him from the nightmare's grip. Her love had been a beacon that guided him through the darkest times, a light that the corruption could never extinguish. They emerged from the crisis more devoted to each other than ever. The Druids of Azeroth learned hard lessons from the nightmare. They developed new protections for those who walked the dreamways, new methods of detecting and resisting corruption. They established protocols for what to do if a druid became trapped in the dream, how to mount rescue operations without falling victim to the same fate. The tragedy of the nightmare had taught them to be more careful, but vigilance could not prevent all future threats. The nightmare had been contained, not destroyed. The Rift of Aln remained open, a doorway through which corruption could still flow if the right conditions arose. The old gods still schemed in their prisons, still sought ways to extend their influence. The defenders of nature knew that they would have to remain on guard forever. Years after the defeat of Xavius, reports began to emerge that the nightmare was stirring once again. The corruption that had been driven back was slowly spreading, creeping out from the Rift of Aln like blood from an open wound. The green dragons, who monitored the dream, sensed a malevolent intelligence behind this expansion, as if someone or something was directing it. The Wormrest Accord, the Alliance of the Dragon, flights convened to discuss the threat. Merithra, daughter of Ysera, and now de facto leader of the Green Dragon Flight, reported what her agents had discovered. The nightmare was actively seeking a new master, reaching out to beings who might serve as its lord as Xavius had done. If it succeeded in finding a suitable candidate, the corruption could begin again in earnest. This news was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. And Zoth was still imprisoned, still plotting, still working toward his goal of corrupting Azeroth. The nightmare was his creation, or at least had become his tool, and he would not abandon it simply because Xavius had fallen. He would find another servant, another vessel for the corruption, and the cycle would begin again. The defenders of nature prepared for the next battle. The druids strengthened their wards, the green dragons increased their patrols, and the heroes who had fought in the Emerald Nightmare raid remained ready to return if needed. They knew that the peace they had won was temporary, that the nightmare would return eventually. All they could do was be ready when it did. Ysera herself was not entirely lost. When she died in Valshara, her spirit was claimed by a loon and transformed into a constellation. But the Shadowlands, the realm of the dead, also had a claim on her. Her soul was drawn to Ardenweald, the plane of the Shadowlands, devoted to nature spirits, where it was tended by the Winter Queen. Ardenweald was a realm of twilight beauty, a place where the spirits of nature went to rest and eventually to be reborn. Great trees grew there, their boughs heavy with glowing fruit that contained the essence of sleeping spirits. The realm hummed with quiet power, a different sort of nature magic than that of the Emerald Dream, but recognizably connected to it. The Winter Queen, eternal ruler of Ardenweald, recognized Ysera's importance the moment the dragon's spirit arrived. Here was one of the greatest nature spirits that Azeroth had ever known, the guardian of the Emerald Dream itself. The Winter Queen devoted considerable resources to Ysera's care, ensuring that the former dreamer would have everything she needed to recover from her trauma. In Ardenweald, Ysera's spirit began to heal from the trauma of her corruption and death. The realm was designed to nurture nature spirits, to restore them, so that they could be reborn into new forms. Ysera was given time to recover, to process what had happened to her, to find peace after the horror of what Xavius had made her do. The healing was not quick. Ysera had been corrupted by the nightmare, had been forced to attack those she loved, had been killed by one of her most devoted followers. These wounds went deeper than the physical, striking at the very core of who she was. Even in Ardenweald, surrounded by healing magic, she struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Other spirits in Ardenweald helped with Ysera's recovery. Nature. Spirits from countless worlds shared their own stories of loss and renewal, showing her that even the most devastating experiences could lead to new growth. Wild gods who had died and been reborn spoke of the cycle of nature, of how death was merely a transition rather than an ending. Slowly, Ysera began to believe that she might find purpose again. The connection between Ardenweald and the Emerald Dream proved important for Ysera's recovery. Though she was physically in the Shadowlands, she could still sense the dream, could feel its pulse and know that it continued to exist. This connection reminded her of what she had protected, of why her sacrifice had been necessary. The dream endured because she had given everything to save it. When the heroes of Azeroth eventually traveled to the Shadowlands, they encountered Ysera in Ardenweald. The former dreamer had recovered much of her strength and her sense of self, though she was fundamentally changed by her experiences. She could not return to her former role. Too much had happened, and the nature of her existence had been altered by her death and resurrection. The reunion between Ysera and the heroes who had fought in the Emerald Nightmare was emotional for all involved. She thanked them for what they had done, for defeating Xavius and freeing the dream from his control. She apologized for the harm she had caused while corrupted, taking responsibility for actions that had not truly been her own. And she offered what wisdom she could about the threats the heroes now faced. But Ysera could still offer guidance and wisdom. She helped the heroes understand the threats they faced in the Shadowlands, shared knowledge that only an ancient dragon could possess, and served as a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be saved. Her presence in Ardenweald was a testament to the resilience of nature, to the ability of life to endure even the most devastating blows. When the crisis in the Shadowlands eventually ended, there were discussions about whether Ysera could return to Azeroth and resume her duties. The possibility was not out of the question. Other spirits had been restored to life before, and Ysera's connection to both Ardenweald and the Emerald Dream gave her options that other souls did not have. Ultimately, Ysera chose to remain in Ardenweald, at least for a time. She felt that she was not ready to return to the responsibilities of the Dreamer, that she needed more time to process what had happened and to understand who she had become. The Dream would have to find a new guardian, or perhaps learn to exist without one. Ysera would watch from afar, offering guidance when she could, but the day-to-day protection of the Dream would fall to others. The question of who would eventually become the new guardian of the Emerald Dream remained unanswered. Merithra was the obvious candidate, Ysera's daughter, who had already assumed much of her mother's role. But taking on the full responsibility of the Dreamer was a monumental task, one that required powers and knowledge that Merithra was still developing. The Green Dragonflight would need time to determine their future. Merithra herself approached this potential responsibility with a mixture of determination and humility. She had watched her mother serve as the Dreamer for thousands of years, had seen the weight of that responsibility and the toll it took. She knew that she could never simply step into Ysera's role, that she would have to find her own way of fulfilling whatever duties fell to her. The other green dragons looked to Merithra for leadership, even as she struggled to define what that leadership would look like. Some expected her to become a new Dreamer, to take on all of her mother's responsibilities and powers. Others recognized that the flight needed to change, that the old ways might not be sufficient for the challenges that lay ahead. Merithra listened to all perspectives, trying to chart a course that honored her mother's legacy while preparing for an uncertain future. Meanwhile, the Druids stepped up to fill the gap that Ysera's absence had created. They took on greater responsibility for the Dream's protection, developing their own abilities to monitor and cleanse the corruption. Malfurion led this effort, using the hard-won knowledge he had gained from his imprisonment to train a new generation of Dreamwalkers. The Cenarian Circle established new institutions dedicated to the protection of the Dream. Dream Watchers were stationed at key points throughout the Dreamways, their job to monitor for any signs of corruption and report immediately if anything was detected. Dream Healers specialized in purifying tainted regions, developing techniques that combined traditional druidic magic with the lessons learned from fighting the nightmare. Training programs were established to prepare druids for the unique challenges of working in the Dream. Students learned not just the mechanics of walking the Dreamways, but the psychological techniques needed to resist corruption and maintain their sanity in an environment that could twist perception and attack the mind. The curriculum was demanding, and many who entered the program discovered that they lacked the mental fortitude required for this work. The relationship between the Druids and the Dream became closer than ever before. What had once been a realm, watched over primarily by dragons, became a shared responsibility, with mortals playing an increasingly important role. This change was not without its challenges, but it also brought new perspectives and new capabilities to the defense of nature. The green dragons initially resisted this change, viewing it as an intrusion into their sacred duty. But as time passed, most came to accept that cooperation with the Druids was essential for the dream's protection. The dragons brought power and ancient knowledge. The Druids brought numbers and flexibility. Together, they could accomplish what neither group could do alone. Joint patrols became common in the dream, teams of dragons and druids working together to monitor vast stretches of the dreamways. Communication protocols were established so that any sign of corruption could be reported and responded to quickly. The partnership was not always smooth, the cultural differences between the two groups sometimes leading to friction, but the shared purpose of protecting the dream kept them working together. The Night Warrior aspect of Elune, invoked by Tyrande during the darkest days of the Fourth War, proved to have a connection to the dream as well. The power of the dark moon affected the dream in ways that were not fully understood, creating ripples that the green dragons could sense but not explain. Whether this connection would prove helpful or harmful remained to be seen. Anzoth eventually made his move against Azeroth, and the corruption he unleashed was far more direct than the subtle influence of the nightmare. The old god's assault on the world was repelled, and Anzoth himself was destroyed, his prison broken, and his essence scattered. But the effects of his corruption lingered, including whatever tendrils he had extended into the Emerald Dream. The battle against Anzoth was fought on many fronts, including within the dream itself. As the old god's power surged across Azeroth, the nightmare stirred in response, threatening to break free of the containment that had held it since Xavius's defeat. The Druids and Green Dragons found themselves fighting a two-front war, repelling incursions in the physical world, while simultaneously holding the line against renewed corruption in the Dreamways. The heroes who had fought in the Emerald Nightmare raid recognized the danger and returned to help. They brought with them experience that proved invaluable, knowledge of the Nightmare's tactics, and weaknesses that newer defenders lacked. Some of them found themselves facing echoes of Xavius, phantom manifestations that drew upon the residual power of the defeated Nightmare Lord. These echoes were weaker than the original, but still dangerous, requiring the full attention of seasoned veterans to defeat. When Anzoth finally fell, struck down by the combined might of Azeroth's champions wielding the power of the heart of Azeroth, the effect on the dream was immediate. The corruption that had been pressing against the boundaries suddenly lost its driving force, its expansion halted by the death of the intelligence that had guided it. The nightmare did not disappear, but it retreated, pulling back to its strongholds in the deepest regions of the dream. The destruction of Anzoth removed the intelligence that had been guiding the nightmare's expansion. The corruption that remained was dangerous, but directionless, a threat that could be contained rather than one that was actively seeking to spread. The defenders of nature breathed a small sigh of relief, knowing that at least one of their greatest enemies was finally gone. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that victory was not complete. The old god had been destroyed before, or at least defeated, and each time the corruption had returned. Anzoth had been the most cunning of the old gods, the most skilled at manipulation, and long-term planning. His death did not necessarily mean his schemes were ended. He might have left contingencies in place, backup plans that would activate even without his direct guidance. The Cenarian Circle conducted exhaustive surveys of the dream in the aftermath of N'Zoth's defeat, looking for any signs of hidden corruption that might be part of such contingencies. They found several pockets of taint that had not been previously detected, subtle infections that had been placed with such skill that even the most sensitive dreamwalkers had missed them. These were carefully cleansed, but the discovery raised troubling questions about what else might be lurking undetected. But the nightmare itself was not destroyed by N'Zoth's death. The corruption had grown too deep roots, had established too strong a presence to simply evaporate when its master fell. The Rift of Aln remained open, the tainted regions of the dream remained corrupted, and the potential for a resurgence remained real. The nightmare was patient. It had existed for thousands of years and would continue to exist for thousands more. The defenders of the dream settled into a new vigilance, one that would continue indefinitely. They established permanent monitoring stations near the Rift of Aln, staffed by druids and dragons who watched for any sign of renewed expansion. They developed early warning systems that could detect the nightmare's influence before it became visible, allowing rapid response to any incursion. Research continued into the nature of the corruption, druids and mages working together to understand the fundamental characteristics of the nightmare. Some hoped that a deeper understanding might lead to a permanent solution, a way to close the Rift of Aln or neutralize the corruption once and for all. Others were more pessimistic, believing that the nightmare was simply too deeply embedded in the dream to ever be entirely removed. The story of the Emerald Nightmare is ultimately a story about the corruption of paradise, about how even the most sacred places can be tainted by evil if the guardians let down their vigilance. The dream was meant to be eternal and perfect, a vision of what Azeroth could be at its best. But perfection is fragile, and the old gods are patient. Given enough time, they found a way to corrupt even this most protected of realms. This tale carries lessons for all who hear it. The most obvious is the danger of complacency, the risk of assuming that something is too sacred or too protected to ever be threatened. The green dragons had guarded the dream for millennia without serious incident, and they had come to believe that their vigil was a formality, a tradition maintained more out of habit than necessity. The nightmare taught them that such assumptions can be deadly. Another lesson concerns the nature of corruption itself. The nightmare did not announce itself with obvious signs of evil. Instead, it worked subtly, gradually changing the nature of the dream without anyone noticing until the damage was severe. By the time the defenders recognized the threat for what it was, the corruption had already spread too far to be easily contained. This is how darkness often operates, through small compromises and gradual shifts rather than sudden dramatic changes. The story also speaks to the importance of unity in the face of overwhelming threats. The nightmare was defeated not by any single hero or faction, but by the combined efforts of druids, dragons, and adventurers from every corner of Azeroth. When the defenders put aside their differences and worked together, they accomplished what none could have done alone. This cooperation did not come easily, but it proved essential to victory. The heroes who fought against the nightmare achieved a great victory, but they did not achieve a final one. The corruption was contained, not destroyed. The Rift of Aln was stabilized, not closed. The dream was restored, but scars remained that would never fully heal. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the nightmare, that some battles can never be completely won, only continually fought. This reality has shaped the attitudes of those who now defend the dream. They do not expect to achieve a permanent victory. Instead, they prepare for an endless war, a continuous struggle against darkness that will last as long as the dream itself. This might seem like a grim perspective, but those who hold it find a certain peace in accepting what cannot be changed. They focus on the battles they can win, the corruptions they can cleanse, the regions they can protect. Xavius, the Nightmare Lord, was the face of the corruption, but he was not its source. He was a tool used by Azeroth, just as the satyrs were tools used by him. The true enemy was the darkness itself, the corruption that the old gods had planted in the dream and nurtured for millennia. Killing Xavius removed a powerful servant, but it did not address the root cause of the problem. Understanding this distinction is crucial for those who would fight the nightmare in the future. The corruption may find new servants, new nightmare lords, to lead its forces and direct its expansion. Each such servant must be defeated, but defeating them will never end the underlying threat. Only by addressing the corruption at its source, if such a thing is even possible, can the nightmare be truly destroyed. Some scholars have speculated about what such a permanent solution might look like. Perhaps the Rift of Aln could be closed, severing the connection between the dream and the old god's domain. Perhaps the corruption itself could be neutralized, its power broken by some magical working of sufficient strength. Perhaps the dream could be fundamentally altered, changed in ways that would make it immune to the nightmare's influence. But these remain speculations. No one has yet found a way to implement any such solution. The Druids who walk the dreamways today do so with greater caution than their predecessors. They know the dangers that lurk in the dream, the corruption that waits to claim the unwary. They take precautions that would have seemed excessive before the nightmare, maintain vigilance that they would once have considered paranoid. The innocence of earlier generations has been lost, replaced by hard-won wisdom. The green dragonflight continues to watch over the dream, though in diminished numbers and with diminished confidence. They lost their greatest leader, saw their mightiest champions corrupted, and faced an enemy that nearly destroyed everything they had sworn to protect. Their survival is a testament to their resilience, but they bear scars that will never fully heal. The younger generation of green dragons has grown up knowing nothing but a world where the dream is threatened. They have heard stories of the times before the nightmare, when the dreamways were safe and the corruption was merely a distant threat. But those stories seem almost like fairy tales to them, descriptions of a paradise that they can barely imagine. Their reality is one of constant vigilance, of patrols and cleansing rituals, and the ever-present awareness that darkness lurks just beyond the boundaries of what they can protect. Yet this generation also brings strengths that their elders lack. They have never known the complacency that allowed the nightmare to grow unchecked. For them, the threat has always been real and present. They train with an intensity that their predecessors never needed, developing skills and techniques specifically designed to combat the corruption. When the nightmare stirs again, as it inevitably will, this generation may be better prepared to face it than any that came before. Ysera's constellation shines in the night sky over Azeroth, a memorial to the dreamer who gave everything to protect the world. Those who look up at those stars are reminded of what was lost in the battle against the nightmare, of the sacrifices that were made to save the dream. The light of those stars drives back the darkness, just as Ysera's light drove back the corruption in her final moments. The constellation has become a symbol for all who defend nature, a reminder that even the greatest sacrifices can lead to something beautiful. Druids invoke Ysera's name in their prayers, asking for her guidance and protection. Some claim to have received visions from the stars, messages from the departed dreamer that offer hope and wisdom. Whether these visions are genuine communications or simply the wishful thinking of grieving hearts, they provide comfort to those who still mourn. On certain nights, when the sky is clear and the constellation is particularly bright, some claim to see the stars move, forming patterns that seem to communicate meaning. These patterns are interpreted differently by different observers, each finding in them the message they most need to hear. The skeptical dismiss these sightings as optical illusions or overactive imaginations, but those who have experienced them describe a profound sense of connection to something greater than themselves. The children of Azeroth are taught about Ysera's sacrifice as part of their education about the world. They learn about the nightmare, about the heroes who defeated it, and about the dreamer who gave her life so that the dream might survive. These stories inspire many young people to pursue careers as druids or adventurers, seeking to carry on the legacy of those who came before. Memorial sites have been established at the places most closely associated with Ysera's story. Valshara, where she was corrupted and ultimately killed, has become a place of pilgrimage for those who wish to honor her memory. The Temple of Elune, where Tyrande made her fateful decision to end Ysera's suffering, holds services in the dragon's honor. Even in Ardenweld, where Ysera's spirit now dwells, visitors come to pay their respects. These memorial sites serve multiple purposes beyond simply honoring the dead. They are places of education where visitors can learn about the history of the nightmare and the sacrifices that were made to defeat it. They are places of reflection where druids and others can contemplate the nature of sacrifice and the costs of fighting evil. And they are places of renewal where those who feel discouraged can find inspiration in the stories of those who gave everything. The Night Elves have incorporated the story of Ysera's sacrifice into their religious traditions. Prayers are offered to Elune, asking that Ysera's spirit find peace in its new existence, and that the goddess continue to watch over the dream as she watched over its former guardian. The priests of Elune teach that Ysera's transformation into a constellation was a divine blessing, a sign that even the most tragic endings can lead to something beautiful. Annual ceremonies mark the anniversary of Ysera's death, gatherings of druids and dragons, and all who revere nature. These ceremonies include both mourning for what was lost and celebration of what was saved. Speakers recount the story of the nightmare, ensuring that future generations will understand the threat that once faced the dream and the courage of those who defeated it. The most sacred of these ceremonies takes place at the spot where Ysera fell in Valshara. Here, Druids plant new trees each year, adding to a grove that has grown to cover the entire area where the corrupted dragon once lay. The trees are blessed by priestesses of Elune, their growth enhanced by druidic magic, their purpose to transform a place of death into a celebration of life. The grove has become one of the most beautiful spots in Valshara, a living memorial that grows more impressive with each passing year. Visitors come from across Azeroth to see it, to feel the peace that now fills a place that once knew only horror and despair. The Emerald Dream itself endures, beautiful and terrible, eternal and ever-changing. It remains a realm of nature's perfection, though now that perfection is marred by shadows that were not there before. The forests still stretch to impossible horizons, the rivers still flow with crystal waters, the mountains still rise in silent majesty. But in certain places, if you look closely, you can see the traces of what was lost. The most observant dreamwalkers can identify the places where the nightmare once held sway. These locations bear subtle marks that distinguish them from regions that were never touched by corruption. The colors are slightly off, the light falls at unusual angles, and there is a faint sense of unease that lingers even after the darkness has been driven away. These are the scars of the dream, permanent reminders of what it endured. Some druids have made it their life's work to study these scarred regions, trying to understand the nature of the damage and whether it can ever be fully healed. Their research has revealed that the corruption changed the fundamental structure of the dream in these places, altering it in ways that resist restoration. The dream can adapt to incorporate these changes, can grow around them like a tree grows around a wound, but it cannot simply return to what it was before. This is perhaps the nightmare's most lasting legacy, the knowledge that some damage cannot be undone, that some losses are permanent. The defenders of the dream have had to accept this truth and adjust their expectations accordingly. They no longer hope to restore the dream to its original perfection. Instead, they work to preserve what remains and prevent further damage. The animals and spirits that dwell in the dream have also adapted to the new reality. Creatures that once roamed freely across all regions of the dreamways now avoid certain areas, instinctively sensing the lingering traces of corruption. New behaviors have emerged as the inhabitants adjust to an environment that has fundamentally changed. The ecology of the dream continues to evolve, shaped by the aftermath of the nightmare, just as the physical world is shaped by natural disasters. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps a dream that has known the nightmare is more valuable than one that has never been tested. The suffering that the dream endured has given it depth, has made its beauty more precious because it was almost lost. The defenders who protect it now understand what they are protecting and why it matters. They have seen what happens when the corruption wins, and they are determined to prevent that from ever happening again. The night holds many secrets, and the dream holds more. Those who walk the dreamways today may yet uncover new threats, new corruptions, new dangers that none have yet imagined. The nightmare was not the first evil to threaten the dream, and it will not be the last. But whatever comes, the defenders of nature will be ready. They have faced the worst and survived. they can face whatever comes next. The legacy of the Emerald Nightmare extends beyond the immediate aftermath of its defeat. The lessons learned during that conflict have shaped how Azeroth approaches all manner of threats. The importance of early detection, of cooperation between different factions, of maintaining vigilance even in times of peace. These principles have been applied to challenges far removed from the dream itself. The Druids who survived the nightmare have become teachers and leaders in their own right, passing on what they learned to new generations. They speak of the darkness they faced, not to frighten their students, but to prepare them, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who fell were not in vain. Their stories have become part of Druidic tradition, tales told around campfires and in sacred groves throughout the world. The green dragons, who endured the loss of Ysera and the corruption of their fellows, have developed a new understanding of their purpose. They no longer see themselves as invincible guardians whose vigilance is a mere formality. Instead, they recognize the very real threats that exist and the constant effort required to counter them. This humility, born of tragedy, has made them more effective protectors than they ever were before. The heroes who fought in the Emerald Nightmare raid carry their experiences with them wherever they go. Some have retired from active adventuring, content to live quiet lives after facing the horrors of the Rift of Aln. Others have continued their careers, applying the lessons they learned to new challenges. All of them bear marks of their experience, visible and invisible, that will remain with them until the end of their days. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the Emerald Dream as it exists in this moment, restored and healing, watched over by druids and dragons who love it. Picture endless forests of green and gold, rivers that sparkle in light that comes from everywhere and nowhere, mountains that touch skies of impossible beauty. This is the world that the Titans envisioned, the paradise that countless heroes have fought to protect. In the deepest parts of the dream, where the corruption could not reach and the darkness never penetrated, there are groves of ancient trees that have stood since before the first mortals walked the world. These trees remember the dream as it was in its earliest days, before any shadow had touched it. Their memories preserve a vision of pure nature that the corruption could never completely destroy. These sacred places serve as refuges for those who walk the dreamways, sanctuaries where weary defenders can rest and recover from their struggles against the darkness. The trees share their memories with those who sleep beneath their boughs, offering glimpses of the dream's primordial perfection. These visions remind the defenders of what they are fighting for, of the paradise that exists beneath the scars of the nightmare. The dream is waiting for you just beyond the edge of consciousness. It welcomes all who approach with reverence, all who understand the sacred nature of the wild places. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you will walk its paths, feel its peace, experience something of the wonder that Ysera felt when she first became its guardian. The boundary between waking and dreaming is thinner than most realize. Every night, when mortals close their eyes and surrender to sleep, they touch the edges of the dream. Most never penetrate deeply enough to reach its true depths, but even this brief contact connects them to something greater than themselves. In these moments, they are part of the vast network of life that spans Azeroth and beyond. The Druids teach that the dream is always present, even when we cannot perceive it directly. It underlies the physical world like a foundation supports a building, invisible but essential. Every living thing draws upon its power, whether they know it or not. The corruption of the nightmare threatened not just the dream itself, but everything that depends upon it, which is to say, everything that lives. But if shadows cross your path, if whispers try to lead you astray, remember that you are not alone. The druids are watching, the dragons are vigilant, and the heroes who defeated Xavius stand ready to defend the dream once more. The nightmare has been beaten back before, and it will be beaten back again if necessary. The light always returns. If you enjoyed this tale of dreams and nightmares, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the world of Azeroth. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the Emerald Nightmare, on the heroes who fought against it, on the questions that still remain unanswered. Share which moments from this story resonated most with you, and whether you think the nightmare will ever truly be gone. Good night, dear listener. Rest well now, and may your dreams tonight be peaceful ones, touched by the light of the dream rather than the shadow of the nightmare.